A number of years ago, I heard a young father, a very prominent young man in the entertainment world, addressing a tremendous gathering in California. It was during the time of the Cold War, and communism and our own way of life were very much in people's minds, and he was speaking to that subject. And suddenly, though, I heard him saying, "I love my little girls more than anything," and I said to myself, "Oh no, don't say that." But I had underestimated him. He went on, "I would rather see my little girls die now, still believing in God, than have them grow up under communism and one day die no longer believing in God."
Hand tied behind their back. I'm hopeful that this fighting will not go on for long and that casualties will be held to an absolute minimum. This is an historic moment. We have in this past year made great progress in ending the long era of conflict and Cold War. We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists. Either you're with us, either you love freedom and with nations which embrace freedom, or you're with the enemy. There's no in between. You're either with us or you're with the enemy. That's clear. I will continue to make that clear.
We're going to build the wall. We have no choice. We have no choice. Build that wall. 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 So, we're going to build it. Who's going to pay for the wall? 100%. By the way, 100%.
Every empire needs an enemy. That's not just a line from a history book. That's not some dusty quote buried in a college lecture. That's an instruction manual. That's the foundation of the American war machine. Because here's the hard truth. Without an enemy, the system doesn't run. Without fear, there's no funding. Without a villain, there's not a story. And without a story, there's no war. Now, in previous episodes in our American War Machine series, we already laid it out. How America was built for war, not by accident, not as a last resort, but as a business model. We covered the military-industrial complex, how it exploded after World War II. We talked about how war became a commodity, how defense contractors like Lockheed and Raytheon raked in billions while teachers get pig slips and veterans sleep under overpasses. But here's the part that nobody likes to say it out loud. None of it works without a good enemy. War needs a justification. You can't just drop bombs and send troops and drain the national budget without a reason people will buy into. Now, it's funny to say that as our taco president decided to send bombs to Iran. So in America, we manufacture reasons like we manufacture cars. Fast, flashy, and for profit. Let's take a walk. Back in the Cold War, the Soviet Union wasn't just a rival. They were the devil. We plastered them across film, radio, textbooks. They were evil, godless, a threat to our very way of life. That branding works so well that even today, people hear quote-unquote socialism and start ducking for cover like Khrushchev is about to bust through the drywall. And then, just as the USSR fell, Suddenly, a new enemy appeared. Convenient, right? Hello, radical Islam. We needed a villain. We got one. In stereo. It was Osama bin Laden's face became the new poster for fear. But don't get it twisted. The enemy wasn't just a man. It was a narrative. A whole new campaign. And it worked. It let us invade Iraq, a country that had nothing to do with 9/11. Because we painted a whole region as dangerous and irrational. We blurred every line until the enemy wasn't a person. It was an entire religion and entire culture. That wasn't an accident. That was design. And when the narrative wore thin, when people started asking too many questions, we shifted again. Now it's China. Now it's the border. Now it's immigrants, trans people, black activists, TikTokers. Because when the war overseas slows down, we just turn the machine inward. We always need a villain because villains justify violence. They justify surveillance. They justify budget increases, drone strikes, closed borders, and open wallets for Raytheon and Booz Allen. And sometimes the enemy isn't even real. Sometimes they're invented, a myth sold to you through media, through fear-mongering politicians, through fabricated stories that serve one purpose: to keep you scared enough to support the next war. Because fear makes people obedient. Fear gets people to salute. Fear sells. This episode we're diving into that machine, how enemies are chosen, not based on morality, not on justice, but on profitability, market share, and good old-fashioned propaganda. We'll trace how yesterday's allies became today's threats. We'll show you how freedom fighters became really terrorists the second it's convenient. And we'll lay bare the ugliest truth of all. Is this empire because in this empire, peace is bad for business. So let's get into it.
In recognizing a communist, physical appearance counts for nothing. If he openly declares himself to be a communist, we take his word for it. If a person consistently reads and advocates the views expressed in a communist publication, he may be a communist. If a person supports organizations which reflect communist teachings, or organizations labeled communist by the Department of Justice, she may be a communist. If a person defends the activities of communist nations while consistently attacking the domestic and foreign policy of the United States, she may be a communist. If a person does all these things over a period of time, he must be a communist. But there are other communists who don't show their real faces, who work more silently.
So let's take it back. Post-World War II, America had just flexed its nuclear muscle on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Allies had won. The world had changed. But victory didn't bring peace. It brought paranoia. See, the Cold War wasn't just a geopolitical conflict. It was a psychological operation, a long, drawn-out performance. And the US government, it needed buy-in. It needed people, regular working-class Americans, to support decades of military buildup, nuclear profitation, global surveillance, and foreign intervention. So cue the Red Scare. Enter Joseph McCarthy. Enter blacklist, loyalty oaths, FBI wiretaps. In the 1950s, you couldn't sneeze too far left without someone calling you a communist. Teachers were purged, artists were censored, neighbors turned into informants, and children, they were taught to hide under the desk in case of nuclear attack. Because somehow plywood and bubblegum were going to stop an atomic bomb. But the fear wasn't just for show. It was a tool. It was how you normalize permanent war readiness. It's how you turn military spending into patriotism. Let's go with some fact checking. Between 1947 and 1991, during the Cold War, America spent the equivalent of 13 trillion, yes, trillion with a T, on military programs. That's more than every single social program combined. We built tens of thousands of nukes. We developed spy planes, satellites, bunkers, missiles that could circle the earth. And what was it all for? Defense, they said. To protect freedom, they said. But here's the part they left out. The part that never made the history books. While Americans were hiding under desks, the CIA was out toppling governments. Let's name names. Iran, 1953. The democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mujahideen, dared to nationalize Iran's oil. That's right, he wanted Iran to control its own resources instead of letting British and American oil companies profit. So what happened? The CIA and British MI6 staged a coup. Mujahideen was overthrown. Now let's go to Guatemala, 1954. President Jacobo Arbenz pushed for land reform. The country's biggest landowner, United Fruit Company, an American corporation. Boom, coup. Install a brutal military regime. Then we have Congo in 1961, Chile, 1973, Nicaragua, 1981. You start to see the pattern, right? These weren't wars of defense. These weren't invasions to stop the USSR from knocking on our door. These were economic decisions. These governments weren't threats to democracy. They were threats to the American capitalism. Because when countries dare to control its own land, its own oil, its own labor, the United States doesn't call that independence. It calls that communism. And with that label, anything goes. Torture, assassinations, funding death squads, destroying democracies. All of it got wrapped in the flag and sold as freedom. Let me ask you something. If we were so focused on defending freedom, why were we so constantly attacking countries that had just elected their leaders? Why were we helping dictators stay in power as long as they were friendly to American businesses? The Cold War wasn't about freedom. It was about the control. And enemies, they were a resource. You could create one by calling a country communist. You could keep the machine running by pointing it to a flag, an accent, a skin color, and saying, "See, that's the threat." And it worked. It kept the money flowing. It kept the bombs dropping. It kept the factories running and the media obedient. Think about it. Hollywood made hundreds of anti-Russian movies. TV shows show brave Americans fighting off foreign invaders. School textbooks erase our coups and invasions from history entirely. We were taught to fear, and fear kept us in line. It wasn't just foreign policy. It was full spectrum propaganda. And when the Cold War finally ended in 1991, you think we'd slow down, right? You think that we'd take a deep breath and said, "Oh, we won." But instead, we ask, who's next? Because an empire without an enemy is just budget cuts waiting to happen. So the next segment, we put past the Cold War into the so-called War on Terror. Because, spoiler alert, the enemy didn't disappear. We just give it a new name, a new face, a new religion, a new justification. Because once you build an economy around fear, peace becomes bad for business. Let's keep it going.
We have no ambition in Iraq except to remove a threat and restore control of that country to its own people. I know that the families of our military are praying that all those who serve will return safely and soon. Millions of Americans are praying with you for the safety of your loved ones and for the protection of the innocent. For your sacrifice, you have the gratitude and respect of the American people. And you can know that our forces will be coming home as soon as their work is done. Our nation enters this conflict reluctantly, yet our purpose is sure. The people of the United States and our friends and allies will not live at the mercy of an outlaw regime
that threatens the peace with weapons of mass murder. We will meet that threat now with our Army, Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines, so that we do not have to meet it later with armies of firefighters and police and doctors on the streets of our cities.
Let's talk about Saddam Hussein. Because if you only heard about him after 9/11, or maybe during Operation Desert Storm, you probably think he was just one more dictator who hated America. But see, that's the edited version of the story. Let's rewind the tape again. Go back to the 1980s, during the height of the Cold War. Saddam Hussein wasn't our enemy. He was our strategic partner. And let's go with the fact check. During the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, the US provided Iraq with satellite intelligence, military aid, economic credits, and yes, even biological and chemical weapons precursors. Why? Because Iran, after the 1979 Islamic Revolution, they had become public enemy number one. So the logic was simple. The enemy of my enemy is my weapons client. The Reagan administration didn't just turn a blind eye to Saddam's brutality. They shook his hand. But fast forward just a few years to 1990. Saddam invades Kuwait. Suddenly he's not our ally anymore. Now he's a threat to democracy. Now he's worse than Hitler. Let's go with another fact check. George H.W. Bush, so George Bush Sr., launched Operation Desert Storm in 1991. It was a 42-day U.S.-led war that included 750,000 troops, over 100,000 Iraqi deaths, and widespread bombing of civilian infrastructure. The kicker? That war really never ended. We imposed sanctions that starved civilians. We maintained no-fly zones. And we kept troops in Saudi Arabia, which, by the way, is exactly what Osama bin Laden used as one of his main justifications for launching attacks against the United States. So let's get this straight. We arm a guy, we turn him into a regional power, then we act shocked when he uses that power, then we launch a war, then we stayed there indefinitely, then we wonder why people in the region hate us. Now let's talk about another group we created, the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Now this one could be a little tricky for a lot of us, but let's go with a fact check. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to fight them in the United States. It, under Carter and the Reagan, pumped over like $3 billion into training, arming, and supplying Afghan fighters. This secret CIA mission was called Operation Cyclone. We handed out Stinger missiles, cash, and training, and we funneled support through Pakistan's ISI. We let militant groups build power with American weapons, and one of those fighters, Osama bin Laden. Now, was he on our payroll directly? No, but he was part of the environment that we built. He grew his network, Al-Qaeda, in a war zone we subsidized. And decades later, that freedom fighter became our most wanted terrorist. Let that sink in. Our government literally compared them to George Washington. The Taliban, same deal. Many early fighters in the Taliban cut their teeth in that same CIA-sponsored war. So by the 1990s, after the Soviet withdrew, Afghanistan was a battlefield of warlords and militias. And we just left. We left the weapons, we left the chaos, we left the power vacuum. And you know who filled it? Extremists, religious hardliners, groups like the Taliban, who eventually gave shelter to Al-Qaeda. So let's add this up. We armed Saddam. We armed the Mujahideen. We ignored the blowback. Then we act like victims. And this isn't an accident. This was a revolving door of American enemies. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The United States war machine doesn't care if yesterday's allies become today's enemies. In fact, it thrives on it. You know why? Because chaos creates contracts. Because instability invites investment. Because threats, real or imagined, are how you keep the military budget bloated. Another fact check. The U.S. defense budget in 2001, before 9/11, was $290 billion. By 2023, it had jumped to $858 billion. That's more than the next 10 countries combined. I've been saying this. This is the game. We fund instability. We act shocked when it explodes. Then we spend trillions clearing up our own mess with bombs, not aid. And corporations profit all the way down. Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, they don't care who the enemy is. They just need you to believe one exists. And when the enemy gets old, no problem, just spin the wheel. Yesterday was the USSR, then Iraq, then Al-Qaeda, then ISIS. Now it's China, now it's TikTok, Russia, now it's protesters at home. Because remember, when the foreign wars slow down, the war machine turns inward. We start targeting immigrants, teachers, drag shows, and activists. Because peace is bad for business. So in the next segment, we're going to talk about exactly that. How 9/11 became the launch pad for permanent war, endless surveillance, and the branding of an entire religion as a global threat. Because the revolving door is not just still spinning, it's a carousel, and we're all on it.
The images of the Twin Towers collapsing were seared into the collective consciousness of every American. America was a nation under siege, and the overwhelming demand from the public was for justice and security. But as the dust settled, the question emerged: who would be held accountable, and how would the nation prevent such a tragedy in the future? In this climate of fear, the seeds of broader conflict were sown. In such a charged atmosphere, the American public was particularly susceptible to manipulation. The overwhelming yet understandable sense of vulnerability and the desire for retribution created fertile grounds for the acceptance of simple, clear-cut narratives, even if those narratives were built on shaky foundations. Fear is a powerful tool, and in the hands of those with an agenda, it can be used to shape perceptions, stifle dissent, and rally a nation around a cause, no matter how tenuous the justification. The emotional weight of 9/11 made it easier to sell the idea that drastic, even preemptive measures were not just necessary, but essential for the survival of the nation. The stage was set for propaganda to take root, turning fear into a weapon that would guide the US into one of the most controversial wars in its history. As the nation mourned and grappled with its vulnerability, the Bush administration began to outline a bold and aggressive foreign policy. Central to this strategy was the ambiguous and narratively charged concept of the axis of evil, a term coined by President George W. Bush in his 2002 State of the Union address. This label was applied to nations that the administration claimed were sponsoring terrorism and seeking weapons of mass destruction, with Iraq singled out as a key threat. For Bush and the bureaucratic administration, addressing the axis of evil was more than just responding to 9/11. It was about reaffirming the global order, eliminating perceived threats, and spreading American influence.
Let's talk about the media for a second. Because the war machine, it doesn't run on oil alone. It runs on fear. And fear needs a microphone. From the front page to the evening news. From pundits to papers, the media plays its role like a full-time PR firm for American empire. This goes way back. So take a walk with me. In 1898, the Spanish-American War, a New York newspaper editor named William Randolph Hearst, you've heard of him, famously told an illustrator, and I quote, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." That's how eager the press was to stir up conflict. And it worked. Yellow journalism, sensationalized, inflammatory, and reckless, helped push the US into the war with Spain after the explosion of the USS Maine. Never mind that we still don't know what actually caused the explosion. Let's go with a little fact check. In 1976, way past that time, a US Navy investigation found no evidence that the Spanish were involved in the sinking of the Maine. But by then, it didn't matter. The narrative was sold. The war had already begun or it already happened. That was over 120 years ago. Now fast forward to 1991. Operation Desert Storm. So CNN had just become the first 24-hour news network. And this was their moment. They turned war into entertainment. Explosions lit up the Baghdad sky in real time, like a Hollywood trailer with real blood. Retired generals appear as analysts. They were countdown clocks, sting music, patriotic overlays. Let's be real. It was war as theater, and the ratings sky high, because fear sells. So when 9/11 happened, the media already had the blueprint. Let's go with a fact check again. In 2003, just weeks before the US invaded Iraq, 70% of Americans believed Saddam Hussein was directly involved in the 9/11 attacks. That's a lie, a probable lie. Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. Al-Qaeda and Saddam were enemies. They hated each other. But that didn't matter. The Bush administration floated the lie. The media repeated it, and the people believed it. Here's a quote from Karl Rove, George W. Bush senior advisor, from the 2004 interview. And I quote, "We are an empire now. We create our own reality." Think about that. That's not just arrogance. That's policy. Create a reality, broadcast it, repeat it until it becomes truth. Weapons of mass destruction? Never found. But that phrase, weapons of mass destruction, was repeated nearly 500 times in the month leading up to the Iraq War on major news networks. Let me say that again. 500 times. Not evidence, just repetition. And the thing is, it worked because the media isn't neutral. It's not just reporting. It's selling a product. And when that product is war, the audience becomes the payload. News outlets don't make money on truth. They make money on conflict, on clicks, on fear. Let's go with another fact check. During the Iraq invasion, networks like Fox News, MSNBC, and CNN all saw massive viewership spikes. Some over 200%. And guess who sponsors those segments? Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Schrocken. You know what that's called? That's called conflict of interest, and it's hiding in plain sight. If Lockheed Martin is sponsoring the news while we're dropping bombs built by Lockheed Martin, how are you going to expect objective coverage? You're not watching journalism. You're watching military branding. And it doesn't stop at TV. Remember Judith Miller from the New York Times? She published a report in 2002 and 2003 claiming Iraq had WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, based on anonymous sources. Many of them later revealed to the United States officials pushing propaganda. Her article helped legitimize the war in the eyes of liberals who trusted the Times. And when it all turned out to be false, nothing happened. No accountability, no retraction that could match the damage already done. And this is a quote from Noam Chomsky. Propaganda is to a democracy what the bludgeon is to a totalitarian state. In other words, you don't need to jail dissenters when you can just flood the airwaves. This is how enemies are created. This is how wars are sold. Not with logic, not with facts, but with emotion, with fear. Because fear suspends critical thinking. Fear makes people obedient. Fear makes people say, do whatever it takes to keep us safe. And whatever it takes, it's always the same. Surveillance, militarization, dehumanization, and war. And when the war turns out to be based on lies, no one's held accountable. Because by then, the money's already been made. The damage is already done. The enemy has already been created, and the next one is already in production. It never ends. Because in the system, media doesn't just report the news. It manufactures consent. It markets fear. It turns soldiers into slogans and war crimes into commercials. Like, we're not watching reality. We're watching a scripted justification for empire. And we're not going to get deeper into that next, into how domestic enemies get fabricated the same way. and how that tactic gets used not just abroad, but here at home against protesters, immigrants, teachers, journalists, and everyday people. Because when they run out of foreign enemies, they just turn the cameras inwards.
I haven't seen one white supremacist. There's a boogeyman of white supremacy, which I don't think anyone can see.
A white nationalist is racist, Senator.
Well, that's your opinion. If Democrats want to say that white nationalists are racist, I'm totally against that too.
Stop calling Tommy Tuberville a racist simply because he talked about having white skin and being a nationalist.
My amendment has nothing to do with whether or not colored people or black people or anybody can serve.
Diversity absolutely means anti-white.
Chick-fil-A, I mean, you know, I'm hesitant to make a fried chicken joke, but they sell fried chicken. I don't know how much more inclusive we can get here.
The State Board of Education just approved new rules for how to teach Black history in public schools.
How slaves developed skills, which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit.
This is well documented among historians. This is historical fact that slaves did develop skills while they were enslaved.
They're probably going to show some of the folks that eventually parlayed, being a blacksmith into doing things later in life.
Right? I mean, you compare black guys to black guys, women to other women. You can't compare Soros to another Jewish guy.
The Soros-backed prosecutors, Soros DA.
Soros prosecutor.
His master, George Soros.
Mr. Soros.
George Soros.
Soros-funded DAs.
You sit down and think about all the anti-Semitism, so-called, not real, so-called.
You had to survive in a concentration camp by having skills. You had to be useful.
The people who are opposed to me are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese.
This guy has a right to say whatever he wants to say, and it's not anymore, if you don't agree with me, you can't say it. That is not America.
Oh, of course the Jews run Hollywood.
So there's another layer we need to talk about. And it's one we can't ignore because it's the most obvious one. Race. Because if you've been listening closely, you probably notice a pattern. The so-called enemy in American wars almost always look different than the average white voter. And that's not coincidence. It's the formula. Brown, black, Muslim, Asian, Latino, communist, foreigner. These identities don't get shown as full people. They get flattened into symbols of danger. Let's think about it. During the Cold War, Russians were portrayed as evil masterminds, soulless, atheist robots. During the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese were portrayed as faceless jungle enemies, swarming, silent, subhuman. And then after 9/11, we didn't just go after Osama bin Laden. We demonized an entire religion, and we still are. Because after 9/11, hate crimes against Muslims in the United States spiked by 1,617% in just 1 year. And this wasn't a glitch in the system. It was the system. TV news show ran wall to wall images of bearded men with Arabic names. Politicians threw out terms like Islamofascism and Sharia law, like they were buzzwords from a movie. Every brown or Middle Eastern man became a suspect. Every Muslim woman became a press. Every mosque became a potential threat. Like, this is what George Bush said in 2001, and I quote, "You are either with us or you are with the terrorists." There was no in between. No nuance, no room for complexity, and absolutely no room for dissent. And if you're thinking, well, that's just how war works, I want you to ask yourself, why do we always imagine the enemy as someone who doesn't look like us? Because while we've been trained to fear brown and black foreign faces, we've been taught to trust white domestic ones. Let's look at some receipts. Charlottesville, 2017. White supremacists with torches marched through a college campus chanting, and this is a quote, "Jews will not replace us." A protester is murder. You remember what President Trump said, right? He said, "Very fine people, on both sides. Now compare that to how Black Lives Matter protesters were treated in 2020. Tear gas, rubber bullets, military helicopters in the sky, armored tanks on American streets. During the summer of 2020, over 14,000 BLM protesters were arrested. Now ask yourself, how many arrests followed the January 6th insurrection that day? Only about 60 at first. No tanks, no mass tear gas, no snipers on rooftops. Even after hours of storming the Capitol, some insurrectionists were calmly escorted down the stairs. You see the double standard. When the threat is wide and right-wing, we look for excuses. He's mentally ill. He was just emotional. He had a bad day. But if the same person was Muslim, they'd be called a terrorist before the news even finished loading. If they were black, they'd be dead before they reached the door. This is what I mean when I say the color of conflict matters. Because war, whether it's foreign or domestic, is racialized. Let's go a little bit deeper. The so-called war on drugs, the war on terror, the border wall, all sold to the public using racial panic. Despite making up only about 13% of the US population, Black Americans account for nearly 40% of those incarcerated for drug offenses. Even though white Americans use drugs at similar or higher rates, immigrants, they were branded rapists and gang members, and they still are, because why not? This is what we are now in America. And ICE raids became normalized. Families were torn apart. Children, literal toddlers, were put in cages. And this is a quote from Trump in 2018. And I quote, "They're animals. These aren't people. These are animals." So language like that is how you prep for public for cruelty. It's how you justify violence. It's how you turn policy into punishment. But it doesn't stop at war and policing. It's in our classrooms. It's in our books. It's who gets labeled dangerous and who gets called disturbed. It's like from critical race theory, bans to book censorship, to labeling ethnic studies as un-American. This country wages war on knowledge too. Because the truth threatens the myth. And the myth of a noble, colorblind America, that myth keeps the war machine running. So yeah, when we talk about war, when we talk about enemies, when we talk about security, we have to talk about race, because race determines who gets fear, who gets bombed, who gets jail, and who gets mourned, and who gets blamed. Malcolm X once said, and I quote, "If you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing." And ain't that exactly what we're living in? Because the brown countries it resist, they're called terrorists. When black communities protest, they're called looters. When white men storm the Capitol, they're patriots apparently. The FBI's own 2022 domestic threat report listed white supremacist extremism as the most lethal domestic terror threat. But you wouldn't know that from watching the news. This segment's called The Color of Conflict for a reason. Because war isn't just about weapons. It's about narratives. And those narratives are painted with color. Over and over and over again. And if we don't start seeing through that lens, we're gonna keep fighting the wrong people for the wrong reasons in the name of the wrong lies. Stick with me on the next segment.
A peace protest in Yellow Springs today against the use of U.S. drones. The Peace Vigil group had a mock replica of a drone on display. It's about 1/5 the size of an actual drone. Organizers say the drone strikes create unnecessary violence overseas, and they're not helping.
And the only way that we're going to solve the world's problems is through diplomacy, through trying to find ways of resolving the world's problems through nonviolent means.
The group says the drone strikes cause people to resent our country even more.
You're young. How old are you?
I'm 22, almost 23.
Almost 23. And you are from this area originally?
San Fernando Valley, just up over the hill.
Fresh out of high school, Robert Rissman signed up to fight for his country.
What makes an 18-year-old join the Army?
I wanted to go to college and make something of myself, and the Army said they'd pay for it.
There's a little bit of a contract. I'm going to serve my country, but then my country's going to serve me.
That's kind of what I was hoping for, yeah.
Where did it fall apart?
It began to fall apart in Iraq.
You saw things that I know you don't want to talk about.
No, I don't.
You probably never want to talk about.
No.
You see, Robert was in a rapid response unit. He saw action, night after night.
I got back from Iraq and I was having a lot of psychological issues, I guess you could say.
Post-traumatic stress?
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Back home at Fort Carson in Colorado, he started feeling like people were out to get him. A few months later, someone discovered Robert's illegal sawed-off shotgun hidden in his barracks. According to Army papers, Robert told investigators he was suicidal. At one point, he spent a full day drinking, then sat on the side of the bed with the end of the gun in his mouth.
I wish sometimes that I had died in Iraq so that my life would have meant something, you know?
Forced to quit the Army, Robert ended up homeless.
Public schools are too damn underfunded. We're selling cupcakes to buy toilet paper. One teacher raised $500 on TikTok just for markers. Another streamed class from her car because the roof caved in. Public schools are broke, not by accident, by design. Rich areas get robotics labs. Poor schools get bake sales and mold. And no one's coming to fix it.
We have great things happening with our military. We also essentially approved a budget, which is in the facility, you'll like to hear this, of $1 trillion, $1 trillion, and nobody's seen anything like it. We have to build our military, and we're very cost conscious, but the military is something that we have to build, and we have to be strong because you got a lot of bad forces out there now. So we're going to be approving a budget, and I'm proud to say, actually, the biggest one we've ever done for the military.
So what do we do with this? Because now we've laid it out. The enemies we invent, the fear we're sold, the racism baked into every threat alert, the media cycles, the lies that cost millions of lives. And maybe you're asking yourself, okay, but what now? This is where it gets real. Because the war machine, it isn't self-sustaining. It doesn't just run automatically. It runs on fuel. And that fuel is us. Our fear, our silence, our loyalty to a lie that didn't ask for, but learned to repeat. Let me say this plainly. Once you stop believing the lie, the machine starts to break. Because the lie doesn't just start wars. It keeps them going. It justifies every bomb, every drone, every $1 trillion defense budget that steals money from schools and hospitals and housing. Since 9/11, the US has spent over $8 trillion on the war on terror. That's enough to cancel student debt, fund universal childcare, guaranteed healthcare, rebuild Flint's water system, and then some. But we didn't do any of that because they told us we were under attack. So we emptied our pockets for bombs and surveillance. But you want to know the real con? It's not just war abroad, it's war at home. We've been trained to fight each other. Black versus white, citizen versus immigrant, red versus blue, civilian versus soldier. We're taught to blame the person at the food bank, not the billionaire cutting jobs. We're told to fear refugees, not the defense contractors getting rich off their displacement. We're told teachers are woke and dangerous, but arms dealers, just businessmen. Here's a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., one that got him vilified back then. And I quote, "The greatest purveyor of violence in the world today is my own government." He said that in 1967, just a year before he was assassinated. And let's be real, the minute he connected civil rights to anti-war protests, the country turned on him. Because that's the truth they fear. that our issues are connected. You can't talk about police militarization without talking about the war budget. You can't talk about mass surveillance without talking about the Patriot Act. You can't talk about gentrification without talking about war-fueled housing crisis. And you can't talk about public school closures while we spend $1 million per minute on the military. As of 2024, the U.S. spends over $877 billion annually on the Pentagon. Again, more than the next 10 countries, because I'm going to keep hammering this, because it's ridiculous how much money we spend on quote-unquote defense. And you know what? That money doesn't buy peace. It just buys weapons, it buys influence, it buys silence. Meanwhile, veterans are sleeping in tents, children are rationing asthma medication, teachers are buying supplies out of their own pockets. And the people doing fine? Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, politicians with defense stocks in their portfolios, presidents and senators who send other people's kids to war, while theirs go to private schools and internships at JP Morgan, and they're safe. This is not security. This is a scam. And we've been paying for it with our money, yes, but more importantly, with our trust, with our attention, with our humanity. Here's the thing that they don't want us to realize. We are not each other's enemies. The immigrant mother working 3 jobs isn't your enemy. The Muslim teen wearing a hijab isn't an enemy. The trans kid trying to survive high school isn't your enemy. The teacher fighting for a living wage, the soldier who came home and started questioning it all, none of them are your enemy. The real enemy is the lie. The lie that says that we need war to be safe. The lie that says questioning the military is unpatriotic. The lie that says power is protection, when it all protects is profit. Frederick Douglass once said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will." So if you take one thing from this episode, let it be this. Demand more. Demand honesty. Demand accountability. Demand that your anger be pointed at the ones who got rich while our communities bled. Because this machine doesn't stop on its own. It only stops when we stop feeding it.
The US and President Trump has overseen America's largest military parade in decades as nationwide protests take place against his leadership. The multi-million-dollar event in Washington, D.C. was to mark the 250th anniversary of the US Army. It coincided with Mr. Trump's own birthday and the anniversary of the creation of the US flag itself, the Stars and Stripes. Critics say it's a waste of taxpayers' money, and elsewhere tens of thousands of people joined nationwide demonstrations under the banner No Kings. They accuse Mr. Trump of attacking civil rights and displaying increasingly authoritarian tendencies. Our correspondent Nomi Iqbal was on the ground at the parade and sent us this report.
It was the military parade President Trump always wanted. On his birthday, a coincidence, he claimed.
Every other country celebrates their victories. It's about time America did too.
There were tanks, armoured vehicles, thousands of soldiers in historical uniforms, flyovers, and even robot dogs.
I saw the power of the American military, which is being rebuilt by President Trump, who I support 100%.
America is used to showing off its military might abroad, but rarely like this on US streets. President Trump sees the military and his command of it as a sign of his own strength, and he's flexing that from coast to coast. Protests in LA against his immigration policies escalated after he sent in the military. There were more protests by those against this parade, seeing it as a costly $45 million display of authoritarianism. Thousands joined in around the country.
Happy birthday, but he's not a king. And he's acting like one. I just wanted to be counted as someone who's really unhappy with everything that's going on, and that, you know, I want to see due process. I want to value our immigrants. We're a country of immigrants. I want the judges to be listened to. I mean, I'm totally freaked out at how fast things are devolving.
On President Trump's birthday, anger and adulation, displaying once again the clashing divisions he ignites. Nomia Iqbal, BBC News, Washington.
Let's take a breath, because this one, it hits hard, but it has to. We've spent this episode walking through a pattern that's as old as this country itself. Step 1, find an enemy. Step 2, sell the fear. Step 3, start the war. Then what happens? The truth leaks out. The footage gets declassified. The apologies come, and if they ever do. But by that time, it's already too late. The money's been made. The medals have been handed out, and the lives lost. We've seen this playbook before. In episode 1, we broke down how America wasn't just built with war. It was built for it. How conquest and militarism were written into the origin story. Long before there was even a Pentagon, how Manifest Destiny wasn't just about land, it was about domination. In episode 2, we look behind the curtain of who profits from all this death. We expose how wars are manufactured to feed the pockets of private contractors, defense lobbies, arms deal. Because this machine, it runs on contracts, not conscience. And now in this episode, we're looking at how it stays alive. How the war machine needs a rotating cast of villains. How the enemy is never static. It morphs, changes shape, disappears when politically inconvenient, then reappears when the budget comes up for a freaking vote. Sometimes the enemy wears a kafia. Sometimes it's a red star. Sometimes it's a hoodie. Sometimes it's just a silhouette they protect onto a screen to justify more spending. And after years of service, years of teaching, years of paying attention, I've realized something simple and painful. The enemy is almost never who they tells us it is. It's not the immigrant. It's not the poor. It's not the protester. It's not the student. It's not the kid with a different religion or the worker with a different accent. The real enemy is the system that survives them here and tells it back to us in the form of flags and missile contracts. Now, I know saying that out loud gets people uncomfortable. I have people tell me I'm anti-American, that I'm disrespecting the troops, that I should just be grateful. So here's what I'll say to that. I love this country enough to want it to stop killing people just to keep pretending it's righteous. I love it enough to want truth, not slogans. I love it enough to fight for communities here and abroad that keep getting sacrificed for somebody else's stock portfolio. And here's something else I've come to believe. If we had spent even half the money we wasted on war on our communities instead, we could have been the most educated, healthiest, and safest country on the planet. No contest. Let's look at it. Let's see, because if you don't think I'm telling the truth, I'm just being exaggerated. Let's go back. Since 2001, we spent more than $8 trillion on the post 9/11 war machine. That's enough to cancel every single student loan in the country twice, provide universal healthcare for over a decade, fund free public college for an entire generation, and end homelessness multiple times over. But instead, we gave that money to Raytheon, to Halliburton, to Northrop Grumman, to surveillance companies, drone manufacturers, and corrupt defense contractors, all while telling Americans to tighten their belts and pull themselves by the bootstraps. We could have been the best. The country that cured disease instead of creating refugees. The country that exported clean water instead of cluster bombs. The country that taught peace instead of rehearsing for war in every classroom with active shooter drills. But we didn't choose that. We chose an empire. And empires, as history has shown us, don't fall because of foreign enemies. They fall because they rot from the inside, because they spend everything on domination and nothing on humanity. So where do we go from here? Well, the next episode we bring it home. Because war isn't just something we export. It's something we import too. In episode 4, we're going to talk about the forever war at home, about how militarized police, surveillance systems, school recruiters, ICE raids, the AI tracking aren't just mistakes. They're features in the machine. Because the truth is, when there's no convenient enemy abroad, they turn the lens on us. They turn in on protesters, on teachers, on immigrants, on anyone who dares to ask questions. So if you're tired of the fear, tired of the division, tired of being sold the same line in the new uniform, keep listening, because the first step is dismantling a machine is knowing how it works. Until then, you keep questioning everything, love hard, don't fall for the easy enemy. I'm Luis. This has been The Problem With, the American War Machine series. Till next time.